Hi, good morning or afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon. So we're Bram and Fokke, and we are going to discuss about a little adventure we had about writing some waypoint plugin.
So my name is Fokke Dekker. I'm part of the customer team at Seaplane. I'm also our resident Golang noob, and before doing this, I've never used Waypoint before. And you might be wondering why I'm telling you that, but I think it's important to know that even if you feel like you don't have the required background knowledge, writing a plugin for HashiCorp Waypoint really isn't that complicated. There's great documentation. There's great people that might be able to help you. So if you feel like you want to do it, just jump in and build one yourself. I'm originally from Amsterdam. I moved to California in 2018. So it's 6:30 local time for me, which is pretty early. If I look a little bit tired or if I talk a little bit slow, that's probably why I haven't had my first coffee yet.
That brings us to me. Hello, I'm Bram. For the English speakers. So I actually went to university to be a molecular biologist, and now over the years I've slowly descended to the dark side to be in operations. And since January 1st, I joined Seaplane to do cloud engineering. Started off as a community member, ambassador, and now I joined the club. This is my 5th year speaking at HashiTalk, so I'm very, very excited to do our talk today. Let's start introducing Waypoint. Waypoint is one of the newish tools that the lovely people at HashiCorp came out with. It allows you to build workflows in a language you should be already familiar with, HCL, so the HashiCorp configuration language. Also, well, we've used it in Packer, we've used it in Terraform just today in the previous talks. And you can extend it with your own plugins. So if the tool doesn't come with the thing you want to deploy, then you can write your own. And that's how we ended up with Waypoint. And the reason why we ended up at Waypoint, we probably should introduce Seaplane, our company at the moment. Promise is not a vendor page, but we need to set up the story for today. So Seaplane is a multi-region, multi-cloud platform that helps developing teams to basically abstract away all the difficult stuff where you want to go global. Right? When people in America wake up, that's where you want to have your load, while Asia goes to bed. So there's no reason to have it everywhere, and that's what our heart is, and that's the platform we've built. So if you go to onboard on Seaplane, you give us your Docker image, and we make sure that it lands fairly close to where your users are. We're in quite a few locations in the world, as you can see, and we're on pretty much any cloud provider, including some of the edge providers. So why do we do this? As I said, we want to abstract away all the difficultness of going global. So we came out with a CLI, an API, even an SDK. So whatever you want to use, we'll provide it to you to stick with your standard developer experience. But we want to go one step further and provide you with the full CI/CD developer experience integration. So how do we get to Waypoint? That's where we want to initially land. This is another layer. Corporate-wise, we're provided with some Mac, so we'll show here how to do it. It's as simple as a brew install Waypoint, and then when you run it locally, there's a one-liner on the screen that you can use to just get it going if you have a Docker running. And then we can get to the UI. If you want to have access to the other ways you can install Waypoint, there's a link on the screen right now. So what are we going to deploy today? We are going to have a simple, who am I little Python application that has 3 routes, gets a 200, shows you a seaplane where we're going to stick with the aeronautic theme today. A 404 will show you a crash. Well, nothing actually, because you're not allowed to see anything. And a 500 was a crashed plane. don't worry, the people made it out safe, but it's always nice to have a crash. If you want to have a look at what the application is all about, there's a link on the screen right now. And then the second part, we'll have Waypoint. We have it installed. We can load something on it. And this is actually what we need to model today into our Waypoint deployment. Right. Seaplane has the notion of flights and formation. So a flight is basically a one-to-one map to your image. You can build locally, like you can do with any Docker image, and then you push it to our registry, and then we deploy it using a formation. And today, naming things is hard, so our flight is going to be a HashiTalks flight, and our formation is going to be a HashiTalks formation where we deploy the HashiTalks flight. You must believe us when we say, we ran it locally, it was successful. We can add, there's an URL we can go to check if it works. So you're going to see your local pub somewhere in the world. For me, it's going to be Amsterdam. For Fokke, it's going to be probably San Francisco or Los Angeles. And for you, it will change. So if you deploy, it will take a while for the platform to converge, but this is the simple notion of Seaplane. Right? How do we map this process into Waypoint? Waypoint has a simple, basic 3-step to get your deploy to in front of customers. There's a build step where we're going to build our container, push it to registry, deploy. In this case, it goes out to us, and then the release of the application. So you can potentially do things like blue-green or canary releases, or you flip a load balancer onto the new deploy. So today we're mostly going to show you the deploy section of writing this Waypoint plugin, which includes deploying your application, getting update statuses, and show them in the Waypoint UI or in your CLI. The Docker build is actually fairly simple. It's a standard build step you're used to, just wrapped in a little bit of Waypoint. So how do we get started? The lovely people at HashiCorp have an example repo set up for us, which you can just clone. You cd into the right subdirectory. There's a clone script. And then you take that code and you take that into your own probably Git repo, and you start developing from there using your local, your local Waypoint setup. Or if you have a more elaborate setup, you can run it inside your Nomad cluster. But today we're going to keep it simple and run it on our local machines. So the Waypoint integration framework has bare bones code set up already for the 3 steps we discussed. And if you drill into deploy, well, the platform is actually split up in 3 things: the deploy, destroy, status. The things we're interested in. For this deploy step, what needs to be done? So we need to have a Waypoint file that we can call using the Waypoint CLI. We're going to give it some input because we are going to share some secrets, because that's how we communicate who's who and to deploy our code. So we're going to have a secret, which we're going to not commit into our code. We just feed it as a variable. We're going to push our image. We're going to deploy it to Seaplane. We're going to get that status, whether or not it was successful or if it's still converging. And then we're going to implement destroy, because when you live in the cloud, the way you spend the most money is not turning things off. So we made really sure that we implemented this destroy function so we can clean up after ourselves. When we looked at these at building this plugin, right, we sort of identified 3 maturity levels. One is we drop out a Waypoint with the local exec to our Seaplane CLI, and then we call the Seaplane CLI. Next one is we'll wrap it around in our plugin, but we still call the local CLI. And the third one is we'll directly call the Seaplane API from the framework. So we don't need to have the CLI somewhere, Seaplane CLI somewhere. So we don't have to build a custom image for our as a waypoint runner. So when you start with this maturity level 1, so local exec, actually turns out it wasn't too hard. You have the deploy resource in your waypoint file. We do this local exec. We make sure that it's all commented out properly in our HCL file, and then we can actually run it. Well, we could sort of run it because one of as we discussed it before, Seaplane deploy actually just take 2 commands to get stuff running, right? We need to declare our flight, then we need to start the flight in our formation. There is no easy way to do 2 local execs in a deploy section, so that's why we got a little bit stuck. Right, we still need to push locally. Where the builds because it's a local exec, we can't really pass around variables, which is a bit annoying. So we don't actually get too good of an update status on these deployments. As I mentioned, the CLI still needs to be somewhere present, needs to be up to date, of course. LCM is always an issue. And the validation of these parameters is not always as what we want. So as a plugin, it's not a plugin yet, but we shown to ourselves that we could deploy to Seaplane with Waypoint. So we want to do better, and this is where I'm going to hand off to Fokke for level 2 and level 3.
Yeah,
so the floor is yours.
Definitely, thank you. And Bram is still going to drive the slide, so you'll hear me say next slide every once in a while. So next slide. Yeah, so as Bram said, we can still do better. The former wasn't really a plugin. It also had some issues around status reporting. It had some issues around actually deploying, as it was taking 2 arguments. So what we're going to do now is we're going to use the same tactic, so deploying through the CLI, but integrate it into the framework, which we thought would be probably the easiest way to get things done without writing too much code. I think we're all probably a little bit lazy, and so we just wanted to get it running as quickly as possible. We're still using the standard Docker builder. We're going to do that throughout all of this process, throughout all of these steps. That pushes the app to the Seaplane registry. But we are going to add a couple required variables to our HCL file, our waypoint file, that we'll use as input arguments for the CLI. And if you remember the steps that Bram showed before when we were looking at the flight creation and the formation creation through the CLI, what we need there is a formation name and a flight name and an image URL. So if you look here at the deploy block in the middle, you can see that those variables are available there. And the last thing we're also going to ask is the Seaplane tenant ID, which we'll use in the image name to identify which image belongs to which tenant. So with that, we can then start implementing the plugin, as you will, the V2 plugin of this. Next slide, Bram. And the first thing we want to do, there's a couple steps that you do in this framework. The first thing we want to do is verify the input parameters. And so for the Seaplane CLI, there's a couple things that we need to take into account. For example, formation name cannot be longer than 27 characters. We can only use alphanumeric characters, and we cannot use double dashes in the formation name. And the reason for all of that is that the formation name is part of the resource URL. So you'll have something like your formation name .on.seaplane.cloud, and that is the URL to your app. And so that's what we do in the configurable notify function in our deploy step. Next slide, Bram. And then obviously the deploy component, and this looks very similar to the local exec. So inside the deploy function, we're going to execute a couple commands. You can see that the first step is the same as before. So we're creating our flight. And then the second step, which is now possible, which wasn't in the maturity level 1 plugin, is creating the formation. Once that's done, the app deployment is live. The next step would be to implement the status function using the CLI, and you do this in the status function inside of the deploy component. This was a little hard though. The way our status update works in the CLI is that it auto updates the terminal. So it's similar to if you've used Waypoint, where you kind of see the updates come in and then the other one disappears. That is cool and it looks great in a terminal, but it's a big pain to process it, especially in Go, and especially for somebody that never used Go before. So that was a bit of an issue, and sort of where this development stopped, and we realized that this wasn't going to be the end all be all for the plugin either. So we can still do better, and we'll talk more about that on the next slide. Yeah, so we can still do better. It still requires the Seaplane CLI, which isn't a massive problem, but it does mean that you have to install it wherever you run this plugin, and so it's a little bit less flexible. We're unable, or at least unable, to report the status of the deployment in the current configuration, which means that if you would go to the Waypoint UI, it would tell you that it's down all the time, which isn't great. There's not really any flexibility to add more deployment settings. So within Seaplane, one of the things that we do is we deploy your application globally, but then we give you a set of configurable settings that allow you to restrict workloads to certain regions, for instance, to comply with things like GDPR. So you can take your workload and say, this can only run in Europe, or this can only run on AWS or GCP. That is what a lot of people like about Seaplane, but to be able to integrate that in this version of the plugin, we would essentially have to have all combinations and permutations of those settings, and or work with some dict where we store them and then process them. All way too much work, because we knew we were going to build a third version of this, which would use the API, so we didn't actually do that in the maturity level 2. And lastly, and I think pretty importantly, we're unable to use multiple tenants or API keys, because you'd have to log in to the Seaplane CLI. And so we would have to create a whole other step where you would log in, provide the new API key to deploy to a new tenant. And yeah, that was a bit of a pain. And so we decided not to do that as well, and move on to maturity level 3, which is the full integration with the Seaplane API. So Bram, next slide. Or next slide again. So for one last time, we have to update our waypoint file. This time, we still need the formation name. We still need the flight name. We've added the API key, and we've taken away the image URL. Because what we're going to do is that we're going to pass the image URL from the build step to the deploy step within the HashiCorp framework. If you start to develop your own plugin, you'll notice that between all these steps, there's components that you can pass along. And so if there's an image URL that you set in the build step, that is available in the deploy step. So you don't have to ask your user for that information, which makes it a lot more convenient to use. Next slide. And then we're going to adjust our deploy and destroy files. And I hope this is readable on the right side here. I know it's quite a bit. All the operations are going to run through the Seaplane API. We're going to reuse the same configurable notify, because we're still using formation name and flight name, and the same requirements still are true. So the name cannot be longer than 27 characters. So we don't have to make any changes there. But we do need to make some changes to our deploy function. And what we do here is that we create a simple post request in Go and fire that off to Seaplane. So you can see that we construct first a flight, and then add that to the post request and fire that off to Seaplane. Above this code, there's some code to authenticate with the Seaplane API. I didn't think that was too interesting, and this is already hard to read, so I decided to leave that out of here. But if you wanted to take a look at the end of the presentation, we'll share a link where you can see the full code base and also contribute if you want. And then we have to implement the status function. And now that we're using the REST API rather than the CLI, we can actually do this. So inside the deploy framework, there's a status function in which you can call and then report on the status of your deployment. And that's what we've done here as well. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then finally, we got to implement the destroy function, which is just another simple delete request with the formation name to take down the deployment. And it looks very similar to this. Like I didn't think it was interesting to include all the REST calls because they're basically all the same. It's just that one is a GET request, one is a POST request, and the other is a delete request. Bram, next slide, please. So yeah, and then there's updating the status. We're using the built-in status SDK provided by Waypoint. And so if we get back at 200 OK from our API, we update the user in the terminal, and then we set the status. So SDK.status report alive will store the status of our deployment. This means that it's available in the terminal UI. It will give you a green check mark, but it's also, in the terminal, and then it's also available in the Waypoint UI. So it will show you that the deploy was successful. Now, in a best case scenario, you would also update this every couple minutes. We haven't done that yet. That's on the to-do list for us because then Waypoint would keep pulling the status of your formation and making sure that it is live. And if not, you'd be able to see that in the Waypoint UI moving forward. That's something that we still need to look into. We had some issues there. All right, next slide. I think we're down to a demo. Yeah. I think before we do that, if you can hit full screen. So here we're in a simple project. We're just going to update our HCL file, the waypoint.hcl file. We'll give it a formation name. And again, naming is hard, so we went with HashiTalk formation. And then the flight name, HashiTalk flight. And once we save that and actually update the API key, then we run waypoint init to initialize the file, and waypoint up with our tenant ID. This will trigger all the build and deploy steps. So the first thing you're going to see here is a simple Docker deploy. This is standard into Waypoint. We've done nothing here. This is just built in. It's sped up a little bit because it can take a little bit of time here. Once that's deployed and pushed, it will start to deploy on Seaplane, and will provide you with a formation URL that, given enough time, it will show you that it's a running application. Now, this is all sped up a little bit, and I've used the power of the internet to just make it look better, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. But here's the destroy step as well. It will ask you if you actually want to do that, and then it's going to fire off the destroy and remove the application. And so I said I made it look a little bit nicer there. We obviously sped it up a little bit because this is going to take a little bit more time than what you just saw. But one of the other things is that Waypoint, the Waypoint SDK, the plugin, has a built-in feature for the resource URL. We couldn't get that to work, and I'm not entirely sure. I've been talking to a couple people over at HashiCorp. There was some bugs or known bugs that there were some issues with that URL showing up into the UI. And so what we've done instead is we've just literally printed it as an output of the application. I think that's one of the things we still want to improve, because once we do that, you can just like have it there, and also easier deploy. It's easier to then move on to the to launch the application, to run blue-green deployments and whatnot. So yeah, that is the integration we've built. It's all up and running. You can look at the plugin itself with the QR code at the bottom left. And then the example project is going to be at the bottom right. And the example project also contains a configured HCL file, so a Waypoint HCL file. So if you wanted to test it yourself with your own Waypoint installation, you can do that. The basic integration is done, but complex deployments aren't possible yet. What that means is that I talked a little bit more about the features of Seaplane, where you can limit workloads to run in certain regions, or don't allow certain cloud providers. That's currently not implemented yet, but it's fairly easy to do because it's just an extension of the JSON that we pass with the post request. We are looking for open source contributors. Originally, the plan when we were building this was that Bram, as an open source contributor, was going to build this together with me, where I was the Seaplane employee and Bram was the was the community contributor. But then Bram and I started to talk more, and it turns out we really had a need for his skills, and Bram ended up joining the team. So if anybody's interested in contributing, we still think this should be an open source project. So we'd love to have to get you involved. I meticulously commented all the code because I was trying to make sense of the framework myself. So even if you're a pure beginner, I'm pretty sure you can just dive in, and I can give you a little bit of a walkthrough as well if needed. I'm more than happy. So email me at my email address that's shown there, and you can get involved. And next slide. Oh, that's it. Any questions before takeoff? I don't think I wasn't sure if there was actually comments here that we could answer to, but yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to email me or to reach out over Twitter. We'd be more than happy to chat. Also, if you have questions about building your own Waypoint plugin, there's great documentation as we've shown before, but it still takes a little bit of time to kind of understand what's happening, and the framework isn't always logical. I've had a couple steps where it was a little bit interesting, at least. So if you're stuck or if you have any questions, just reach out. I'd be more than happy to help.